go.
Yeah, let me know when you want me to make my awesomely epic introduction.
Cool. All right, it's live. I just need to grab the link and tweet it out. All right, tweet it out so we can go whenever you're ready.
All right. Hey, everyone. We are live. I'm Matt Friedman, Matt F. the Oracle of Fantasy Labs and RotoViz. Welcome to the April 9th, 2017 NASCAR edition of RotoViz Live. I'm joined by Dr. Nick Giffen at RotoDoc, an editor at RotoViz, a PhD in mathematics, a two-time qualifier for the DraftKings NASCAR main event, and one of the best NASCAR DFS players in the world. Nick, how's it going?
I am doing well. It was quite the eventful morning with the tiny pass issues we had, but glad I got that. I definitely am in need of a beer for all of that stress that put me under.
You're probably like halfway through that one.
Yeah, I'm pretty close. I have a backup downstairs too. So
okay. All right. So let's get started. And as always, it seems as if there are drivers who have some issues with their car and they move back to the field. So talk about that. We have Jimmy Johnson, Casey Kane, and Trevor Bayne who have moved back in the field. What is that going to do for the race?
Yeah, so Jimmy Johnson, Trevor Bayne, Casey Kane, as you mentioned, are all moving to the rear of the field for things that happened essentially after qualifying. So their qualifying position still counts wherever they qualified for DraftKings scoring. So in the case of Casey Kane, it's way back there in the mid 30s. Jimmy Johnson, it's 24th. So Casey Kane's exact position is 35, Jimmy Johnson 24, and Trevor Bayne 12. Those will be their starting positions for DraftKings scoring. But all three will be moving to the rear of the field to start the race, essentially as like a penalty for different issues. Bayne wrecked, Kane wrecked, and Johnson had to change off of his qualifying tire. So some different issues there. So those guys will be moving to the rear of the field. But again, for starting position purposes for DraftKings scoring for that place differential, Trevor Bayne will be scored from 12th starting position, Jimmy Johnson scored from 24th starting position, and Casey Kane scored from 35th position.
Okay, I mean, what does that do for someone like Trevor Bayne? I mean, I don't know if he was even on, and it's early in the podcast for us to be talking about Trevor Bayne anyway, but I mean, I don't know how on the radar he was anyway, but starting 12th, he's in the backup car, right?
I think, yeah. So had he not had to go to the backup car, I actually think he could have been in play this week. He said this is the best car he's ever had, and of course he wrecked it in practice. He was pushing it too hard. He could go so fast, and his car was so good that he was trying to see if he could test out maybe making the track a little wider because it's a new track surface. So it's only essentially one groove right now. He was trying to see if he could widen out that groove, and it didn't work, and he ended up getting into the wall, and he wrecked, quote, the best car he's ever had. So I'm assuming the backup car is not as good. Plus, he has to come all the way from the back now to get to his 12th starting position, and then he still needs to surpass that. So I think Bayne is out of play. Johnson and Kane, I'm not worried about. They'll be fine. So, and they start far enough back that they're still good, both value plays.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Trevor Bayne, he flew too close to the sun. Now, there are two main factors for the race and the slate that I think we should talk about first to kind of get it out of the way. And we talked about this on the podcast we did on Friday, but it's always good to revisit this. So first, for qualifying, there were 9 drivers who didn't make qualifying runs, so they are starting at the back of the field. And all of those guys, or not all of them, but a lot of them offer some value. So we should talk about those guys. But then also, and maybe more importantly, Texas Motor Speedway has been repaved and reconfigured since the last race there. So this is the first race with this new surface, which, as you mentioned, it seems to affect Trevor Bayne in his practice runs. So how do those two things converge to make like the dynamics of this slate that we're dealing with?
Yeah, so it's obviously with the qualifying deal, there were a bunch of cars that didn't make it through technical inspection. They have to pass inspection because you can't have an illegal car going out to qualify. And so several cars did not make a qualifying run, and that includes some big names like Kyle Larson, Chase Elliott, Kyle Busch, and Eric Jones, a lot of big names back there. Casey Kane we talked about, and then Chris Buescher's back there. So Dale Jr., a lot of big names. So all of those guys essentially become in play for cash games and even in GPPs, obviously, because if they're in NASCAR, if you're a good cash game player, also a decent GPP play, it just tends to be a chalkier GPP play. So, they're all fine plays, but you can't fit them all in your same lineup. So you're going to have to pick and choose which ones you use in different lineups. And we still have to think about the fact that there's going to be Dominator points. And that's where kind of, for me, where the track comes into play, these track changes, a new track surface, lowering the banking in turns 1 and 2. So Texas has repaved their surface. That means it's brand new. So it's not going to eat up tires like it used to. Plus, Goodyear had to bring a harder tire because they didn't get any testing time. So tires are not going to wear in this race. It's going to be a one-groove racetrack. It's going to be very hard to pass. And so Kevin Harvick starts in the pole. I expect him to lead the first 30 laps at least. We get a competition caution at lap 30. So NASCAR is going to throw a yellow flag at lap 30 just so that teams can test the tire wear and stuff because it's a brand new surface. And so I expect Harvick to at least lead the first 30 laps, probably get 10 to 15 fastest laps in that first 30 as well. Somebody like Ryan Blaney, who starts second, is going to have a tough time. That second groove, if you watch the Nationwide race, the Xfinity race, I still, years later, can't get the sponsor right, but the Xfinity race, the outside groove on the restarts just didn't get going, and the second place guy would lose 4 to 6 spots basically on in each restart, and that inside line would take off. So, if people are, I think I've seen some questions about people asking, is Ryan Blaney a good contrarian dominator? I would say probably no, although, like, if something were to happen to Harvick, Blaney has a strong enough car that I guess you could play him in like 5% of your lineups, but he's not really a dominator pick for me. He would have to get the lead through pit sequence stuff, which is possible. And so that's why I think, if something bad were to happen, Harvick and Blaney gets the lead, then he could be a good contrarian dominator pick, but I don't think it's that likely. So anyway, to tie it all together, you're going to have to go with these place differential guys that you're going to mix and match, and you're going to have to take like Harvick and maybe one other potential dominator and kind of mix and match those lineups. So I've been doing a lot of one dominator lineups, and I've been doing some 2 dominator lineups. I haven't been doing many 3 dominator lineups as I've kind of constructed rosters just because there's so much value in that place differential.
Yeah, so kind of following up on that and thinking about roster construction and the excess value that we have in place differential drivers this week. Do you think that means that this is, I know some weeks you're more of like a 1 cash game lineup type of guy, and then some weeks you maybe go 2 or 3 cash game lineups. Is this one of the weeks where to kind of consolidate and make sure you hit on those different value plays, you're going with more cash game lineups?
I'm going with 3, yeah. So I want to mix and match those guys in the back and make sure I get my dominator right, which is, of course, Harvick in cash. I do think I have 1 cash lineup with 2 potential dominators because I really do want to get those dominator points in at least one of the cash lineups. So I've got a Harvick and another dominator lineup. So, but the rest are just mixing, matching those guys in the back. That's so 3, hoping to have 2 of them be over the 50% mark in terms of the percentile.
Yeah. All right. So we have some Twitter questions. We're going to get to those. Before that, as always, I want to remind you that you can get a 30% discount to a special NASCAR pass through our NASCAR podcast homepage, rotoviz.com/NASCAR podcast. With that pass, you get unlimited access to all of Nick's premium NASCAR content, and your subscription supports the pod. Also, if you want more NASCAR insight from RotoDoc, Nick has some courses at Roto Academy. One of those is with JM to Win of Roto Grinders. Check those out at rotogrinders.com/Roto Academy. Nick, obviously, we're going to get to the Twitter questions in just a little bit, but since I just mentioned the RotoViz Pass, I think now is a good time for you to talk about some of the updates that RotoViz is going to be doing with the NASCAR product after Easter.
Yeah, so we are going. So next weekend is Easter weekend, and NASCAR has off that weekend. I have off that weekend. It'll be a fun weekend. My wife is defending her PhD this coming week, so we're flying to North Carolina. So it's actually worked out really well in terms of timing. But once we're back the weekend after Easter, we're going to have some new content on RotoViz. People have been asking for ownership projections. We're going to have those. So I will have a model that predicts ownership percentage, and I will post those in my articles that come out with my picks and projections. We're also going to have ownership projections. So you asked for it. We're going to deliver that, no problem. The second thing that we're going to have at RotoViz is, so if you looked at my article this week, I gave all of those sim scores, which are ways of comparing the current driver and the current track to past drivers that have similar stats at very similar or the same type track. So that's a useful app because it lets you see a nice range of outcomes for how similar types of drivers have performed in the past at similar tracks. So we're going to have that SimScore app actually be an app that you can use. So you can take the drop-down menu and say, I want to look at Jimmy Johnson's comparables, and it'll show you Jimmy Johnson's comparables for that race weekend. I think we're going to do some extra things with it where you can either have DNFs on or DNFs off, so that you want to look at what are his comparables when he finishes the race versus what are all of his comparables, whether they finished or not. And then you can see a DNF rate, different things like that. So a historical DNF rate for similar drivers at similar tracks. So I think it's going to be a super useful app. We already do the same thing with our NFL content, with our, we call it the GLSP, game level similarity projections. I don't have a cool acronym yet for it for NASCAR, but we might just call it the NASCAR sim scores or driver sim scores or something, but we'll figure it out. But it's going to be ready for Easter, for the race after Easter, which is Bristol. The ownership projections will be ready as well. And I think this show as well will probably end up going on the RotoViz Live page, and we'll probably end up doing something with that. Matt, I don't know if you want to taltalk more about that or anything.
No, I don't.
Cool. Yeah, well,
you can talk about it.
Well, so instead of doing this on YouTube, which has been a good deal for us, we're going to try to have it embedded on the RotoViz Live page to provide more value for our readers. I think it'll probably end up going behind the paywall eventually. I don't know if it'll be the first race back from Easter break or maybe the second race back, but it'll probably end up going behind the paywall. That way, the people who actually pay for the content will also get to be the ones that view the video. And so that, if you don't pay for the content yet, yes, we're glad you've been following along, but it's going to go behind the paywall eventually because that way I don't give out all the goods for free that our listeners have, or readers that, paid readers have paid to have. So we're going to make that transition after the Easter break as well, whether it's the first or second race back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also Days of Thunder sim score, I think, would be the way to go with that. Okay, so let's get to Texas Motor Speedway. So first question here, what are the chances of a big back-end wreck at Texas? Not sure how common those are at this track. I'm looking for ways to fade the chalk.
Yeah, there's chances for a wreck in the back, certainly. If you watch the Xfinity race, there were a couple big wrecks. With the hard tire, with the brand new racetrack, there is somewhat of a lack of grip. So I think, unlike Atlanta, where we saw drivers obviously easing it into the corners because of so much tire wear and so much abrasiveness, and they're able to deflate their tires and get a lot of grip, there will probably be more wrecks than there were at like Atlanta or even Las Vegas, which had not a new surface, but compared to Atlanta, a much newer surface. And so I think because we have the really hard tire, a brand new surface, we can definitely see a lot of wrecks. There's only one groove. So if you get into the gray like Bain did in practice, you're going into the wall. So I think there's a chance we could see some multi-car wrecks this weekend at Texas. Whether it's going to impact the ones in the back, who knows? I mean, we can't predict wrecks, but we can say there probably is a higher likelihood of wrecks happening at Texas than maybe like Atlanta or Vegas.
Mm-hmm. And probably a higher likelihood now at Texas in comparison to what we would have seen at Texas in the past.
Definitely, yeah.
So you mentioned the Xfinity race. Just a quick follow-up question I have on this. I think I've asked you this question before, and you haven't sort of like quantified like any correlations between the Xfinity race and the NASCAR race that happens the next day. But how do you sort of anecdotally use what you see in the Xfinity race to inform the decisions you make about NASCAR?
Yeah, so a lot of times I don't use it a lot, but I can use it to see maybe what the style of racing has been like. So, for example, yesterday, as I said, the outside groove doesn't start well on these restarts at this track right now. So that's actionable information we can use. We can expect Harvick to get out front. We can probably expect Clint Boyer, who starts third, to be in second place at the end of the first lap, get that jump on Ryan Blaney. Certainly, I would say a better than 50% chance that happens because of that inside groove being the preferred groove. The other thing we can use, as I mentioned, is talk about the fact that there are wrecks, because we saw that happen in the Xfinity race. We saw it happen in practice, drivers wrecking. So I certainly think there's a higher probability of that. And the other thing I will say for this particular race weekend, which I don't normally carry over in other race weekends, is a lot of times we have Cup drivers who drop down and race in the Xfinity race, and people say, well, because they got used to the track or whatever, they should be good plays. And most weeks I say no. I'm like, these guys already are the experts at these tracks, and they don't have any advantage by racing the Xfinity race. Nothing quantifiable, not even really anecdotal. I don't use it. But I think this weekend, the drivers that did race in the Xfinity race probably have a little bit extra knowledge, because this is a brand new deal. Like, nobody's ever raced a race on here now until the Xfinity guys raced a race on this new surface and this new layout. So I think this might be one of the weeks where I give a little bit of a bump to, not a huge bump, a little bit of a bump to guys that ran the Xfinity race. So that would be like Eric Jones, Joey Logano, Kevin Harvick. I think Austin Dillon ran the race, and Ryan Blaney ran the race. So there's a handful of guys that certainly I think you can give a small bump to.
Mm-hmm. All right, next question here. Who are some sneaky dominators to stack with or without Harvick? I'm trying to avoid a 39-way tie again.
Yeah. So for those who missed it last week, in the big GPP, there was like a 39-way tie for first, or depending on the GPP you're in, and they're in the $3. I think it was like a 59-way tie for second, because somebody had that one unique lineup. So congrats to them for having like that one pivot that made it a number one lineup. But so to answer the question, I think so in likelihood of dominance, my model, and I also personally, obviously first like Harvick, second like Brad Keselowski, and third I like Martin Truex Jr. I know he's starting a little bit further back, but his 10 lap speeds were pretty good. So I don't hate Martin Truex Jr. as a play there for a Contrarian Dominator. Contrarian Dominator. I think a lot of people are on Clint Boyer, but his practice times were super slow. So even though I think you'll be in second place at the end of that first lap, I don't think he gets past Harvick. I think eventually he falls back because he's not that fast. He was 24th in final practice on the single lap. In second practice, he was 12th on the single lap. If I go down to the 10 lap averages for Clint Boyer, he didn't even run a 10 lap in practice 3, but in practice 2 he did, and it was somewhat further back. It was down towards the middle of the field, not too far towards the middle. It was about 10th. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but just eyeballing it, looks about 10th best. So just his single lap speed was concerning. He doesn't look fast enough to lead. And then my like super sneaky Contrarian Dominator. So I mentioned Keselowski and Truex. I have this weird feeling Matt Kenseth is going to dominate a race. My model gives him maybe like on average leading about 5 to 10% of the laps if we were to run this race a ton of times over. But I just liked his 10 lap average in that second practice session. He didn't make one in the third practice session, but in that second practice session, fastest 10 lap average. So certainly can't discount that for Matt Kenseth.
Okay, so you mentioned earlier the competition caution at lap 30 to allow teams to kind of examine their process and their tire wear and all that stuff. The question is, how might this impact dominators or the race in general?
It could impact dominators in that if Harvick has a pit problem, then he probably won't be, leading after that 30th lap. So, there is some merit to fading Harvick a bit on that, but no, that's definitely going to take the right scenario for him to get past on that sequence, because he's got the preferred pit stop position, which always means you'll, without having a pit problem, always means you'll get out first. So if you come in first, you'll definitely get out first. So, we're banking on Harvick essentially having a pit problem there, and, that's certainly possible. Harvick's had some problems with his pit crew in the past, so there could be some merit to fading Harvick there in terms of if he gets shuffled back through a pit penalty or a bad pit stop, then he's not going to accumulate a ton of Dominator points. That said, I still think he's going to get the first 30 plus 10 or 15 fastest laps. Plus, he's still going to get shuffled back and have a chance to pick up some fastest laps and have a chance to get to the front again. So you can fade Harvick is what I'm saying, but do it at your own risk. I think Harvick is a super chalk play this week, and I will be a lot of weeks I try to fade him when I think he's super chalk, but I'm not fading him this week.
Okay, so the question here has to do with true potential for great Dominator points today. So, uh, do you think, like, on the scale of sort of like just sort of like average domination to like massive domination that we saw in one race last year, I think with like Kyle Busch, like what is the potential, like the magnitude for domination today? Or is it better to focus more on place differential?
Well, so we definitely need a dominator in our lineup, whether it's one or two. And that's just going to come down to race dynamics. Harvick led 90% of the laps at, I think it was Atlanta earlier this year. If he does that again, we need one dominator. If he leads 40% of the laps and somebody else leads 40% of the laps, we need two. And that's also possible. So I think those are the two most likely scenarios, is we either get one massive dominator or two dominators that go something like 60-40 or 50-30 or something like that. So we're either going to need one or two dominators in this race. I would almost bet on it. I think there's a little bit of a chance that there could be a three dominator lineup. And then obviously with all of those guys coming from the back, all of those big names. And then you could also throw in like Jimmy Johnson, who starts 24th, for example. A lot of big names coming from the back. Certainly, I think a handful of them will finish in the top 10 and get you just massive points. So you have to balance the dominators with the place differential. It's not a sole place differential week. There's 334 laps, which is 134 more than Daytona, and it's much easier for one person to stay out front and lead, unlike Daytona. So we definitely need at least one dominator this week.
Okay, who is your top contrarian pick, and then your top fade out of someone who might have higher ownership?
Top fade of higher ownership will be Joey Logano. I know he raced in the race earlier, the Xfinity race yesterday, but I just didn't like his practice speeds. My model doesn't hate him in terms of his dominating potential, but I think if we look at practice speeds and we compare him to Truex or to Keselowski, especially over the long run, I much prefer Keselowski and Truex to Logano. So I think he's my expensive fade. In terms of a contrarian pick, I like AJ Allmendinger. I think he's going to be really contrarian. I don't think he's going to be used that much at all. I think his ownership percentage will probably be around 10%. But if I go look at his starting place in qualifying at 16th, in practice he was 15th and 7th in the single lap speeds, and in the 10 lap speed for practice 2, he was 7th best in 10 lap speed. I don't think he made one in practice 3, but so everything we have to go by with AJ Allmendinger shows he's pretty fast this weekend, faster than his qualifying position. So I like him as my favorite contrarian pick. I don't have a huge amount of him. I will be overweight on him compared to the field, but don't go bananas. Obviously, Chris Buescher in the similar salary range, starting way further back, is the super chalk. But let's say he wrecks out, then where are you going to go with your cheaper plays? Certainly, I like Allmendinger. I think Eric Almirola may be less contrarian. I still think he's also a good play in that 6K range as well. Similar reasoning to Allmendinger. They both start 16th, 18th in that range and practice much better than they qualified. But I think Almirola is going to be the chalkier of the two between Allmendinger and Almirola.
All right, so you're looking at Harvick as your primary dominator. Someone has a really good question. Are you worried that Harvick's consecutive 10-lap average is not even in the top 17?
No.
So, how do you account for that?
No, with Harvick, he doesn't care about his 10-lap speed. This is something we found out last year as we started really digging into the 10-lap stuff. Harvick's transition from a driver that back in 2013, would try to put up a fast lap in practice, and now he doesn't care about putting up a fast lap in practice. That's just flashy material for the scoreboard. So he cares about having a car that is comfortable, that will race well, and I think he's there. I think he's pretty happy with his car. He's starting out front, so he'll have the clean air. I certainly think he leads at least all of those first 30 laps, barring something happening to him wrecking or barring another caution coming before that.
Yeah, he's like Allen Iverson with practice. He doesn't care.
Yeah, he just tanks it in practice. No.
Yeah. Okay, this is a good question. What strategy do you employ to select lineups in 3 entry max tournaments versus 150 max?
What lineup strategy do I use? Is that
what strategy to sort of to construct lineups in 3 max versus 150?
150 max, I'm much more concerned with ownership percentage and just trying to hit optimal ownership percentages while still making my lineups sound from a roster construction perspective, whether that means targeting the right number of Dominators and the right number of place differential guys, or maybe the right number of guys starting in the middle of the field that I think can come a little bit forward, especially if they're cheaper type stuff. So in 150 entry type things, I'm super concerned about ownership percentage. If a guy is 20% owned and I think he has a 40% chance of being in the winning lineup, I will definitely go at least 40% on him to try to get that leverage. So that's how I approach 150, what we call mass multi-entry. For 3 max, I try to pick a much tighter core, obviously, and I try to mix and match that really tight core among those 3 lineups. So whether that's a core of Dominators, whether that's a core of place differential drivers, in this case this week, it's a bit of both. I'm mostly mix and matching in the 3 max, the place differential guys, throwing in a GPP play or 2 here or there. I talked about a couple of those already, like Almirola or Allmendinger. And then mostly trying to be chalk with Harvick at Dominator. Some weeks, if I think the Dominator is a lot harder to predict, I might mix and match my Dominators instead and go more fixed on my place differential guys. But I tend to have a pretty tight core, so I tend to either hit or miss my 3 max, but I think that's a totally fine strategy. If you looked at my lineups last week, they were pretty tight. I obviously in the 3 max, I use one of the lineups I used was the winning lineup for a lot of those GPPs, so I won all my 3 max, but my second lineup was really high up there, and my third lineup just barely missed cashing. So that shows I still have a really tight core, even though I didn't cash in that third one. I was like 26th percentile, or almost top 25 percentile or something. So that was a nice day. But that shows I have a tight core with my 3 maxes usually.
Mm-hmm. So following up on that and kind of combining it with a question that was asked later, can you talk about single entry? And because they don't specify, I'm going to have this like as a 2-part question. One, single entry when it is just like a single bullet, like maximum type of tournament, but then also single entry when lots of people can max enter.
So single entry, when it is single entry, I think instead of putting in like your cash game lineup, you should put in your best GPP lineup. Because I think in single entry tournaments, people tend to throw their cash game lineup in there, and that means we have a lot more similar lineups, a little bit more chalky ownership percentages. That's not always the case, but I know a lot of people do have that mindset where they'll just throw their cash game lineup into a single entry. So I like going my best GPP lineup. So what does that mean? It might mean you have a few chalky plays, but you certainly want 1 or 2 that are nice contrarian plays that you think have a higher probability of being in the winning lineup than their ownership percentage. In terms of single entry in large fields, I'm not so sure that it super changes, but because there's the mass multi-entry component, I think there's a little bit more merit. These fields also tend to be larger, just overall fields. I think there's a little bit more merit to, instead of maybe having 1 or 2 contrarian drivers in your best GPP lineup, maybe adding a third, or maybe really finding a nice pivot play or something like that in a similar price point. So the strategy doesn't change too much. You can still throw that best GPP lineup of yours that you're putting in the single entry into your single entry in a massive field, but I really don't think it changes a ton. Maybe go a little bit more either contrarian or pivot play type thing.
Okay, so this question is, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but thoughts on employing Blaney as a Dominator pick, as a contrarian Dominator pick. I guess what I'm going to do is adjust this question a little bit and say, like, that second, like, outside non-preferred groove, how much is that factoring into what you're doing? So it obviously factors into decisions with Blaney, but kind of like how far down the line does that, like, impact stuff?
I don't think it goes too far down the line, because I think there's a chance right there in the 4th starting position is Joey Logano. Brad Keselowski starts 5th. I think there's a chance Keselowski lets Logano in. And also Blaney, of course, is a teammate to Keselowski and Logano, so he could theoretically let both Blaney and Logano in. That means he'd have to hold up the inside line. So it's not like the most likely thing to happen, because I don't think Keselowski wants to hold up everybody behind him and do that, because it can be a risky situation. If you do that, you can get hit from behind and spun out. We saw it at one of their restarts earlier this year. But I think, I certainly think that Blaney is probably a fade, and it could go down to Logano and in terms of like the initial start. But once that initial start is done, I don't worry about it too much. I'm more just concerned about the Dominator potential, especially at the beginning, because then we'll have the race play out, we'll have pit stops, people will come out either in third or in fourth, and that's going to make all the difference in the world, whether they start on the inside or the outside on any of these restarts when we inevitably have cautions. We're going to have cautions. We're going to guarantee to have a competition caution on lap 30. We're guaranteed to have 2 cautions for the segments, and I'm almost sure we'll have some wrecks. So, we'll definitely see some cautions this week.
Yeah, so you talked about the segments. I don't know if we mentioned the segments on the show or not on the podcast. I don't think we did, but can you talk a little bit about the segments, where they come, and how that might play in with any type of pit strategy and stuff like that?
Yeah, so the segments are 85 laps for segment 1 and segment 2. So we're going to have the first segment end at lap 85. The second segment will end at lap 170. From there, it's 164 more laps to the end of the race at lap 334. So with those segments, how does the strategy play out? Well, because we have the competition caution at lap 30, I think segment 1 changes a little bit. Everybody can come in at lap 30, get tires, get fuel, go to the end of the segment. And so I think that strategy probably stays the same for everybody. But in segment 2, when do you pit is certainly a valid question. I think with all of the cautions that we're going to possibly have, I would prefer pitting later, because it means you're not going to pit early, and then a caution is going to come out and you get trapped a lap down and have to take the wave around or whatever, or get the lucky dog. So I would prefer pitting towards the end of that, especially with no tire wear or very little tire wear because of the hard tire. So I think the vast majority of people will be on the same strategy: run it till it's getting towards dry in terms of gas, come in, pit for tires, finish the segment. So I don't think the strategy is hugely strategic this weekend, which is why I didn't talk about it on the podcast earlier in the week. That said, the guys in the pit box have all the data, all the information. So certainly they have possibly some tricks up their sleeve that I'm not privy to.
Okay, so I think this is an interesting question here. So with the expected cautions and DNFs on the new surface, similar to what we had at Kentucky, do you think that Derek Cope at 4,600 starting last would be a good super punt?
I don't, simply because Derek Cope never finishes the race. I want somebody, if they're a super punt, I want a driver that actually is going to probably finish the race. So if I look at who those people are, Derek Cope starts dead last in 40th. Timmy Hill starts 39th. He's super slow. There's a good chance he doesn't finish the race. But I think if you go up from there, Jeffrey Earnhardt, and then Reed Sorensen is probably the first guy I would look at, is Reed Sorensen. He's going to run to the end. Problem is, he starts 30th, and he's going to get passed by Kyle Larson, Chase Elliott, Kyle Busch, Case Kane, Eric Jones, Dale Jr., Chris Buescher. So I don't even know if we'll get positive place differential, even with all of these cautions. So it's pretty hard to do a super punt this week. I don't have any exposure to super punts. That said, if Derek Cope or Timmy Hill does finish the race and 10 drivers wreck out or have problems, sure, I guess they could be in the winning lineup, especially with all the expensive drivers that are in the back and the expensive drivers that we expect to dominate the race. Maybe that's a way to go a little bit contrarian. I'm just not going to do it this week.
Okay, so you like to follow Garage Talk and what guys say on Twitter. And so it looks like Junior said something about this being one of the hardest races to pass at. Does that change anything for you? And then also, is there anything interesting that you found on Twitter in regards to this race?
Yeah, so speaking of Dale Jr., so actually I posted in my article 2 tweets, and the first was from Dale Jr. He said he loves his car, essentially, was happy in second practice, happy in third practice, number 1 in average lap time. I think that's over 5 consecutive laps because he didn't make a 10-lap run. So certainly Dale Jr. is happy with his car. He also mentioned it's hard to pass. It's definitely a little concerning, simply because it makes it harder to come from the back to the front, but with 334 laps, with all the cautions I expect that we're going to have, there's going to be a chance to leapfrog people in the pits. They may not get from the back to the front as quickly as we'd like them to, but I think eventually the good guys will make their way forward. There's enough time, enough laps, enough weird things happen in a race that, Kyle Busch starting in 36th or whatever it is, 35th, 34th can win this race if he has the best car, right? Like, I'm not saying he will, but if hypothetically he were to have the best car, he could still win this race coming from 34th starting position. So the other tweet that I mentioned that I put in my article was one from Eric Almirola. I wrote him up this week. Certainly he's really happy with his car.
Okay, someone's asking, is there any reason to go lower down than Buescher this week?
In price? I think yes. I think there's a couple drivers that we could kind of look at. So the first I mentioned on the podcast, I think, is Cole Witt. I don't hate him. I don't have a lot of exposure to him. I have actually very little exposure to him, but I think that driver starting there in 28th, he's shown he can finish these mile and a halves pretty well this year. So if he just avoids the carnage, I think he could come away with a top 24, which would be like 20 points for finishing position plus 4 for place differential. That 24 points right there for a driver that's 55,000 something is a good deal. The other two drivers I think we can consider, especially one more than the other, are the drivers that we talked about on the pod, Michael McDowell and Landon Castle, starting 13th and 15th. And I'm like, why would we ever do this? But if they can hold their position, they will be in the winning lineup. These are two drivers that if they finish where they start, they'll be in the winning lineup. And I think between all the carnage, the fact that they not only qualified that high, but both have shown some speed in practice. With Castle, it was over the 10 lap in practice 2, which is the first practice after qualifying. McDowell, it was on the single laps. He was 14th and 14th in the single laps in both post-qualifying practice sessions. So I think with both of these guys, you can take a couple shots. I wouldn't go heavy on them by any means, but I think it's an interesting way to go really cheap and then have a lot of expensive guys in your lineup. Like if McDowell starts 13th and finishes, as we talked about, 14th, then that's going to be 30 points for finishing position, -1 for place differential. So 29 points at a driver that's 5,500. That's more than 5x, which is huge for a punt play like that. It allows you to get your Dominators, allows you to get those expensive place differential guys that could go from 35th to 5th, right, and get you 30 place differential points and 40 finishing position points. That's like a 70-point day plus some fastest laps, etc. So not a high percentage play. It's a low percentage play, but it does have a probability of happening with McDowell and with Castle.
All right, so someone's asking your reasons for omitting Truex in the podcast, despite kind of mentioning the Charlotte race several times.
So
I probably asked that question horribly.
Yeah. So I guess when we do the podcast, you ask for the 2 most likely Dominators. So I picked Harvick and Keselowski. Truex is my 3rd most likely Dominator. So we just didn't make it 3 most likely Dominators. I think that's the simple answer.
All right. This is a sneaky question, and we're not going to answer it directly, but they're basically like, who's going to win the race, or who's going to be in the winning lineup? But who are the drivers out of the whole field who have the best chance to be in the winning lineup? So,
I have no idea, honestly. It's probably a lot of the guys starting in the back. Buescher, I think, obviously being at 6,000, but has a top 20-something, or 20 to 25th place car. Those drivers starting in the back: Dale Jr., Larson, Elliott, Kyle Busch, Kevin Harvick. Those are all the chalk. I mean, those are all the guys who are playing in cash as well.
Standard roster construction this week is for 1 or 2 Dominators, and then the rest place differential guys. Is there any other type of roster construction this week that you like? Yeah.
So we mentioned about the guys that are like in the 6K range that are starting a little bit further forward, and if they come away with a top 12, top 10 finish, those are guys that could be in the winning lineup, because if they finish 10th, that's 34 points, plus they're getting 6 to 8 police differential points. So that's like 40-something points for a driver that's 6,500. That's certainly going to have a chance at being in the winning lineup, especially if they finish a little bit higher, or they pick up some fastest laps or things like that. They'll be in the winning lineup. So I think that's a roster construction we can use as well, is a Dominator or 2. If you go 2 Dominators, then you can go like 3 place differential guys, and one of those guys starting in the middle of the field, one of those cheaper middle field guys that we think can make their way forward. Whether that's an Allmendinger, a Stenhouse, Almirola, Danica, whoever you want it to be, those are certainly some options. Ty Dillon, for example. I think that's another viable roster construction. Aside from that, like we said, 1 or 2 Dominators, mostly place differential guys. That's basically what I've been doing is those 2 types of roster constructions: the 1 or 2 Dominators with place differential, or the 1 or 2 Dominators with place differential plus 1 mid-pack type guy that's cheaper.
Okay, out of Kyle Busch and Chase Elliott, who do you think scores the most DraftKings points today?
I have no idea. I mean, they're starting 33rd and 34th, and we have no idea how Texas is going to race. We know, I guess if we just look at practice times, it's probably Kyle Busch versus Chase Elliott. But I mean, this isn't even splitting hairs. This is like splitting, like, I don't know, graphene or something.
That was horrible. Okay, so I think this is a kind of good question, but at the same time, the answer might be impossible to know. But which stat is more important for Texas, the best consecutive 10-lap average or final practice speeds?
Best 10-lap average ended up being more predictive in the model that I used for like similar tracks at the past. So we talked about what tracks are those. Kentucky last year, Charlotte with the less tire wear of the quad ovals. We can also go back and look at Kansas in like 2012, 2013, right after they had their repave. And again, the 10 lap was more predictive there. So look at the 10 lap more than the single. Problem is we didn't have a lot of 10 lap in final practice. We only had 17 drivers make a 10 lap. So can't really use our full judgment there. So we're going to have to take some from practice 2 10 laps. We're going to have to take some single lap data. But so it makes it really tough this week because not everybody made those 10 laps in final practice.
Mm-hmm. All right. So given some of the randomness that we could have this week, how comfortable are you leaving, or what is the amount of salary that you're comfortable leaving not in your lineup? Let me rephrase that. Leaving on the table.
I think it's probably like a standard week. I think up to like 1,500 is okay. I probably wouldn't go much more than that. I certainly think there's some viable roster constructions, as I mentioned, with Buescher starting in the back, or Allmendinger or Almirola or Danica or Ty Dillon. Maybe going with 2 of those and being like super contrarian. That would put you at 3 guys in the 6K range. Maybe then you use Dale Jr., who's only 8,500, and then 2 expensive guys. I think it probably leaves you like 1,800 on the table. I think that's probably like the lowest I would go in salary left on the table. I think my top lineup actually for some of these 3 maxes I'm doing has 1,000 on the table. So I do have one lineup that I'm leaving a lot of salary that I actually feel good about too.
Mm-hmm. Who is the most, and we've kind of touched on this question, but this is a little bit different. Who is the most expensive fade for you this week?
Definitely Joey Logano for me. Starts 4th, so that outside groove, least likely of those guys starting far forward to dominate for me, especially based off of practice times and things like that.
Okay, we have a 2v2, Chase and Cole versus Kane and Jones.
Chase and Cole versus Kane and Jones, easy. Cole Witt is a super low percentage play. Kane and Jones are 2 place differential guys that are starting 35th and worse. So they both will definitely come forward. We have no idea what Cole Witt will do. Definitely Kane and Jones, although it's the way chalkier of the 2, but I still think the probability is much higher that that's a better combo.
Mm-hmm.
So when I mentioned Cole Witt, like that's a super low probability play. I just think like I have to kind of throw his name out there as somebody that I think could be potentially maybe not in the winning lineup, but in a good lineup because we're asking about guys under 6,000, and I think he's not the worst play under 6,000. I just wouldn't have much exposure to him all.
Right, he's like one of those kind of like low probability edge plays, and eventually, like if you accumulate enough of those, one of them really pays off during the season.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Yeah, exactly. You think his odds of having some sort of success will be greater than his ownership.
Yep.
Yeah. A 3-person comparison here: Stenhouse, Danica, and Almirola for GPPs.
Almirola. That between Stenhouse and Danica, I don't know. They should just elope and get engaged and leave the race. But definitely Almirola for me. And then I know Stevie likes Stenhouse. I think I like Stenhouse. He had a good 10-lap average in one of those practices, but it's hard trusting Stenhouse at a race where you can wreck a lot. I think I might go with Danica over Stenhouse just because she starts further back and I think is less likely to wreck than Stenhouse.
What is the Stevie argument for Stenhouse? What is it that he likes about him?
So Stenhouse starts 11th, and I don't want to give all the way of Stevie's stuff. Obviously, that's behind his paywall, but I think basically he thinks Stenhouse can finish about where he started, and that could be good enough for a driver that's that cheap. And so when I look at it, I look at that 10-lap average for Stenhouse. I think it was in practice 2 that looked pretty good. He was no, I'm sorry, it was. Oh wait, I have to scroll down. Yeah, it was. No, must be practice 3. Let me click over to practice 3. But I'm pretty sure he had a 10-lap that was good in one of these practice sessions. Yeah, in practice 3, he was 4th out of 17 drivers.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, Truex versus Keselowski.
I'm going to go with Keselowski because I think he'll be possibly lower owned because he's more expensive, especially on a race where a lot of expensive drivers are starting in the back. Plus, we've got Harvick, who should dominate. And I think he's a little bit more likely to dominate than Truex, although it's definitely close between those two for me.
Okay, Kane versus Jones. They're close in price. Who is your favorite for GPPs?
Jones, just because I think he's got the better car this weekend. He's shown a little bit more than Kane has in practice. Also, he won the Xfinity race yesterday, so if we're going to give any credence to Xfinity, as I talked about, he gets a little bit of a anecdotal bump from that. So I'll give the nod to Eric Jones over Kane.
Is Suarez a good pivot off of the chalky mid-range drivers?
He's not the worst pivot, actually. So I failed to mention him, but I think he's certainly in play. I think Suarez, so he starts 20th. He was 6th fastest over the single lap in final practice. There's definitely merit to starting him in a race where I don't think his ownership percentage will be high at all. So what would that require, though? That would require, obviously, maybe somebody like Eric Jones or Casey Kane or both having issues, right? Because if Eric Jones can come from 35th to 7th, whereas Suarez can come from 20th to 7th, well, one's better than the other. So certainly I think he's a good pivot off of Kane or Jones in some of your lineups. I just don't think, and Austin Dillon right there at 7,500. I'm not a huge fan of Austin Dillon this weekend simply because I think RCR has been a little slow. But of the 3 RCR cars, he's been the fastest, and he starts 25th, which gives him some place differential potential. So Dillon and Suarez, Austin Dillon and Suarez are nice pivots off of Jones and Kane. I just wouldn't do that in a lot of lineups. I think, again, these are like 15% type ownership plays.
Okay, so a follow-up question on that. You mentioned RCR. Do you feel any better about RCR this weekend based on the final practice and then anything that they mentioned in Twitter?
No, I feel worse about RCR. So we talked about stacking teams type stuff. I think this is a team we could fade. So we've got Ryan Newman. He qualified 9th, but then in the 2 post-qualifying practice sessions, he was 20th and 27th. His 10-lap average wasn't very fast either. I don't have it immediately in front of me if I'm going to click around and do things. But then we've got Paul Menard. He was slow, qualified 22nd, but then practiced 32nd and 28th over a single lap. Also had really slow 10-lap averages. I'm positive of that. And then we have Austin Dillon, who qualified 25th. His practice 2 was 30th on the single lap. Practice 3 was 20th, so a little better, but not like, knocking the doors off the thing. So I think Austin Dillon is possibly the best of the RCR guys, but I certainly think RCR could be a team to fade this weekend.
Okay, so we have a 2v2 here. Jones and Almirola versus Kane and Allmendinger.
That's a good one. See, that's perfect because that's like 2 drivers at similar starting positions, one in the back, one in the front, at similar price points, and then just flipping it with the other 2 guys. So Jones and Almirola is what I'm going to go with. But, I certainly can't hate on Kane and Allmendinger. That's definitely the lower probability play, though, with Kane having the worst car versus Jones, and with Allmendinger starting a little further forward than Almirola. So I'm going to go with Jones and Almirola.
All right, what are your thoughts on Kurt Busch? He's starting 10th, and he has good history at Kentucky and Charlotte.
Not really using him. He's so hard to see an avenue to the winning lineup. I guess he would have to finish like in the top 3, pick up some fastest lap points. I guess it's not out of the realm of possibility, especially if we get a lot of restarts. I mean, Kurt Busch is good on restarts, but the issue is the restarts this time are basically just going to be whoever's on the inside line is going to move forward. It's a lot like Bristol, where the outside line at Bristol just always wins in the restarts. So you kind of are coin flipping on whether you're going to go forward or backward. So even if you're good at restarts, this is one of the tracks where it matters probably a little bit less than normal. So Kurt Busch practiced 8th in practice 2, practiced 18th in practice 3 on single lap. He didn't catch my eye in terms of 10 lap averages either. So I don't think he has a huge chance of being in the winning lineup. So in practice 3, final practice, he was 5th out of 17. So like kind of a third of the way down, just under a third of the way down. But that's still like a third of the field, I guess, in a 40-car field is like he's still 10th or 12th or 15th or whatever it ends up being, ballpark. So he needs to do better than that to be in the winning lineup, and I just don't know if he has the car or the starting position, or still a little too expensive for me. Even though he has come down in price this year, he's $8,000, whereas last year was pushing $9,000. I just don't see an avenue to the winning lineup for me.
What do you think about Buescher's ownership percentage in the $3 GPP?
It's gonna be high. I think it'll be higher in the higher stakes. I think it'd be lower in the $3, but I still think it should be over 40%. I know it'll be at least 40%. It would be my guess. I would think probably even anywhere between 40 and 65% wouldn't surprise me. I think in the higher stakes we'll be pushing that 65% number, possibly even a little bit more. But in the lower stakes, I think where there's less sharp stuff going on, I think we could probably see between 40 and 55 most likely.
All right, you think that high?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, he's 6K. He's starting 38th. He's faster than a ton of guys in front of him. I mean, like Reed Sorensen starts in front of him, Matt DiBenedetto, Corey LaJoie, David Reagan, Greg Galding. So just a ton of guys that start in front of him that he's faster than on raw speed. I think he's possibly, my opinion, he probably is the chalkiest play this week, given salary and 15 to 20 place differential expectation.
Right. So it's interesting. So you said that you think the higher this stakes get, the higher his ownership percentage will be. But obviously there comes I guess like a tipping point or some sort of like equilibrium where like his odds of having troubles or not finishing or whatever, like where do you think that is for him?
I think probably around 55 to 65%, right around where I think his ownership percentage will be in the higher stakes. So that's just the best guess of me. I think, so in Texas, or not in Texas, in this race, I think we'll get about 80% of the laps run under green, which means 20% will be run under caution. If we translate that to a number of drivers that won't finish the race, I think that ends up being about 6 to 8 drivers. So out of 40, what is that? That's not even a quarter. So like 20% maybe, let's say, don't finish the race. So there's a 20% chance Buescher doesn't finish the race, maybe because he's in worse cars than others. Add a 5% to that, add some chance that he wrecks on his own or is maybe just not as good of a driver, and then just the other things that could happen. Maybe he only finishes 28th instead of 23rd. So I'd say there's like a 35 to 40% chance he's not in the winning lineup, maybe even like 45% chance, but I think that's, like I said, right around that 55 to 65% ownership. I think anything in there is fair. Once we go beyond 65, I think he becomes somebody I want to go a little underweight on.
Okay. So of the high price drivers who are starting near the back, so those chalky place differential guys, Larson, Busch, Chase, Dale Jr., which of those are you most likely to fade?
Kane and Larson. Larson simply price point for me. He's 10,300 and he starts the furthest forward of all these guys. I think it's probably just as likely like Kyle Busch finishes as high as he does, and Kyle Busch is a $400 discount and starts 2 spots further back. And then Kane, I just don't think has the best car among like Jones and Kane. I guess his price point is nice, and the fact that he starts far back is nice, but I just think he has the worst car of like those guys. I'll say those instead of those 7 drivers, I'll exclude Chris Buescher from it. So those 6 drivers that are starting in the back that I think have a chance normally on many weekends to put up a top 15 or better, I think Kane probably has the worst chance this weekend.
Mm-hmm. All right, so Truex is starting 7th. Logano is on the outside non-preferred group starting 4th. Why do you like Truex better than Logano?
Practice.
As a potential dominator.
Practice, definitely. So Truex had a very nice 10-lap average in, I think it was practice 2. I have to keep clicking back and forth between these. So in practice 2, he had the third best 10-lap average, whereas Logano had 4, 5, 6, 7th best. But then if we also just look at the single lap speeds, Truex was much faster in single lap. No, I take that back. Truex was 22nd and 16th, and Logano was 6th and 25th. So if you look at practice 3, which is the one that's closest to the race time, Truex was 16th, Logano 25th. But certainly over the longer run, Truex has the better car, and I favor the longer run based off of what my model's telling me. So start 7th. He has that inside line on the initial restart. That helps, but I don't think that really helps a ton, given that we're going to see a lot of cautions and stuff. But Truex has also just been very dominant at the mile and a half this year. It's been the Truex and Keselowski show between, especially at Vegas. It was the Truex and Keselowski show. I guess it was Harvick at Atlanta, but I think those three are the three, Harvick, Truex, and Keselowski, that are going to be the best at this track as well. That said, I just, unless Harvick has a pit problem, I have a really hard time seeing anybody else leading this race, So Harvick is clearly the dominator this weekend. He's
the LeBron of the slate.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess, LeBron can dislocate a thumb or something, so.
Right. What's Logano's likely ownership?
That's a really good question. I don't think it's going to be that high. I really don't. I don't think it'll be that high. I think it'd be 15, 20% tops.
Yeah.
We've got all those expensive guys starting in the back. We've got Harvick. We do have Truex and Keselowski stealing some ownership percentage from him. We've got Johnson, who's also in the back we haven't talked much about, but starts 24th. Certainly Johnson's viable if he wins this race, which has a very fast car. So, and people haven't been mentioning Johnson. Like, we haven't talked about him. Johnson could go under-owned, right? So, what is Logano going to be? Probably 15%, I think.
Yeah. A couple more questions here. How much Harvick is too much Harvick in GPP?
That's a really good question. That is a really good question. I guess probably around that DNF percentage plus maybe 5 to 10% for some pit problems. So maybe like 65, 70% is fair. If you start going above 70, especially if it's above 75%, it might be too much. That said, I'm above 75%.
Right. I was going to say, you're definitely on the too much side.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. But that's the risk. I like going, as I say, I have a risky profile. I like pushing the boundaries just because I think if Harvick does lead, or if Harvick doesn't have a problem, he will be in the winning lineup.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think this is going to be the final question here, and I do like this question here. So what are your thoughts on pairing Brad and Truex and then fading Harvick in GPPs?
Don't love it. I think if we fade Harvick in GPPs, you probably want to go with one or the other. I guess there's some merit to playing both to make sure you capture the Dominator points, but I don't think both of them will dominate if Harvick doesn't. I think it could be one or the other. We might see a surprise like a Blaney with a fast car. So if I'm fading Harvick, which I am, I think in one lineup, I have Blaney as my Dominator in that lineup. And it's not because I think he'll dominate at the start. It's because I think Harvick has a problem on lap 30. Blaney gets out first.
All right. So, final question here. You always mention on the podcast who you think has a chance to win the race, but obviously it's always conjectural because we don't have all the information yet. What are your thoughts now?
So I'm still picking Harvick. Certainly things can happen with all of the restarts, all of the potential cautions we'll see. That I don't feel good about the pick. That said, I have him in a ton of lineups just because I think he'll get a lot of Dominator points, but that doesn't mean he'll win. So I think it's going to be Harvick. He's my pick, but I don't feel great about it. Some other names that I think have sneaky potential are Jimmy Johnson and Dale Jr. And Ryan Blaney. I think those three have some sneaky potential, and I was maybe at the casino last night and may have placed a bet or two.
That's interesting. Okay, actually, I am going to ask one more follow-up question here. You mentioned Kenseth, I think, earlier as a sneaky Dominator play. Do you think he has sneaky potential to win or no?
Yeah, I do. I think just looking at that 10-lap average from practice 2 where he was the quickest is a nice piece of data, considering he didn't make a 10-lap run in practice 3. I think people were doing that because they probably figured out their car as best they can in practice 2, and then in practice 3, you really don't want to wreck your car at that point. They save it for the race. So I think that's a nice piece of data. I will definitely be overweight on Kenseth compared to the field.
All right.
And I bet on Kenseth too. I did, actually. He was 18-1, so I bet on him.
All right, there you go. I had a sense. So,
I don't know why he's 18-1. I mean, I guess that's okay, but like, I know we're not a betting site, but yeah, I like Kenseth this week.
Okay, actually, I'm going to ask one more question here. So stuff like this can maybe change because Vegas odds are always changing. But so here's the question where this is coming from. Salaries for PGA are very correlated to Vegas odds. And so have you noticed any particular correlations between Vegas data and what we see with NASCAR? Either that's in the salaries or in finishes or things like that.
Yeah, definitely in the salaries. There's a lot of correlation. I know DraftKings takes a lot into consideration takes the Vegas lines into consideration. But those are certainly early week. Then we have practice, we have qualifying, all sorts of things that can really, I think more drastically than PGA, shift the odds. So that's why at the end of the week, if you look at the odds at the end of the week, they less correlate with salary than they do at the beginning of the week. So the beginning of the week, before anything's happened, those odds, when DraftKings releases their pricing, does correlate strongly. And they definitely take into account track history, but those are also somewhat reflected in Vegas odds.
Yeah. So for PGA, comparing it to NASCAR, it would be like if you were able to make some bets and DraftKings had a weekend slate for PGA this week. It would be like if you were able to update based on information like we are able to do with practice 1, practice 2, and practice 3.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, that's going to do it for this NASCAR edition of RotoViz Live. For Nick Giffen on Twitter at RotoDoc, I'm Matt Friedman at Matt F. The Oracle. Thanks for tuning in.